welcome to this very special night with Octavio Paz. I'm Dr. Frederick G. Williams, Chairman of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And it's been a real thrill to have Octavio Paz here as a Regents Lecturer at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. We've had a full 2 weeks. This is part of that. And he has shared with us seminars and interviews and his lovely wife. And all above board. I'd like to remind you that Octavio Paz will be speaking again here in Campbell Hall this Friday at 8 o'clock. He will be reading his own poetry in Spanish with English translations by Elliot Weinberger from New York. Also on Friday, we will be hosting the second annual Mexican Conference, or Conference on Mexico, which will be held at the USEN Pavilion. And as part of that, there will be a special presentation by Octavio Paz as part of his seminar at 2 o'clock in Buchanan 1920. Both the Friday night and the all-day conference on Mexican literature, which incidentally will be all focused on Octavio Paz's work, will both be free and open to the public. Distinguished scholars from across the United States will be presenting papers on him. Mr. Paz will be introduced by Professor Emeritus Alan Phillips of the University of California, Santa Barbara. And as part of the presentation, Mr. Paz has agreed to entertain questions. In order for everyone to be able to hear the questions, there are 2 mics, and we would ask that you use the microphones to ask your questions. Otherwise, people won't hear, and it will be lost. Dr. Phillips.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the university community, friends and colleagues, Marie-Jo and all the lovely wives, and of course, Octavio. Professor Williams, Chairman of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, has invited me back to Santa Barbara from my secluded life of retirement to make a brief presentation of our speaker of the evening. I am glad to be here again and feel deeply honored to present to you a great poet and brilliant essayist in the person of Octavio Paz. He is, as you all know, a major world figure, and his presence here tonight is a genuine credit to the university. His stature as a creative writer has been recognized in many ways and in many lands by a seemingly uninterrupted series of awards and distinctions bestowed upon him, a list too long to dwell upon now. I obviously do not have any comparable credentials which entitle me to introduce Octavio Paz, except perhaps that we have known each other for a number of years, meeting in various places, in London, England, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Austin, Texas, in Norman, Oklahoma, and of course on several occasions in Mexico City. Nor do I forget his generous comments on an early book of mine and the fact that years later on a cold and rainy night when there were no taxis to be had in Mexico City at all, he made a special effort to come downtown from Coyoacan to listen to me read an undistinguished paper in rather austere circumstances. I mention this gesture, so much appreciated then and now, only as an indication of the measure of his personal kindness. There have been in his literary life 3 events that must be mentioned here, since they have had such a significant influence upon him as a writer. First of all, the Spanish Civil War was decisive for many poets of his generation, as well as for him. Readers of Paz's poetry will recall that in a memorable poem, he remembers those tragic days of the Madrid of 1937. And in other moving pages, both in prose and in verse, he describes the impact that the Civil War and its combatants had upon him. Several years later, now in Paris, he came in direct contact with a surrealist group of writers and artists, particularly with André Breton. Incidentally, without wishing to minimize the influence of surrealism on Paz, I venture to say that it was more for him an attitude and an ideological experience than a technique of writing. But indeed, it was a liberation. For a period of some 5 to 6 years, Paz remained in Mexico, and these were years of intense creative and cultural activity, the time of the Revista Mexicana de Literatura and the group of Poesía en Voz Alta. However, having entered the Foreign Service, Paz made his initial visits to the Far East, to Japan and India, and of course he acted as a later date as his country's ambassador to India from 1962 to 1968, resigning his post under circumstances which are recent history remembered by all. It is only natural that these years of residence in India had a deep influence upon his thought and the development of his work. In the years following his resignation, Paz held distinguished academic positions in this country and abroad, including the Charles Eliot Norton Chair at Harvard, and at a later date was Regents Fellow at the University of California in San Diego. He returned to Mexico in 1971, again becoming instantaneously the center of intellectual activity, just as he had in the 1950s. Plural was launched and was soon followed by Vuelta, still being published today. In the interest of brevity, I am not going to read what I have written about Paz's literary formation, his likes and dislikes among writers of the past, both classical and modern, although my intention had been to say something at least about his readings in an international context. It is impossible to characterize Paz's poetry in a few words, in part because of its scope and variety, ranging from long, unfettered verse forms to the highly synthetic Japanese haiku, a type of poem or image which has captured his interest for many years. I hardly need to refer to the immense quantity of his literary works. To read Paz the poet, and all his pages are charged with poetry, is always an exciting adventure and a stimulating experience. He does not have indifferent readers. Like Tablada in his day, Paz is a young poet, in the vanguard and in constant change or evolution. Different, yes, but always true to himself and to his fundamental beliefs. In the case of Paz, I suspect that they have not changed all that much over the span of the last few decades. Poetry for him, then, is exploration and discovery, a search for our real beginnings where contradictions are reconciled and united. In a word, poetry is revelation and search for meaning, a quest for self-knowledge and identity. Any reader of the verse of Octavio Paz is immediately struck by its verbal richness and splendor, the magic of poetic imagery. One of his major concerns, as evidenced in his essays on the nature of poetry and in innumerable poems themselves, is precisely the word, subjected at all times by Paz to close vigilance. At this moment, I recognize that I am about to plunge into extremely dangerous waters, and can only hope that I am not misinterpreted when I say that Paz is a reflective poet, even perhaps a mystical or certainly a metaphysical one. But the intrusion of intellectual reasoning is never excessive. To the contrary, his thought is alive and vital. He is passionately committed to concrete, not abstract human values. He gives precedence to feeling, emotion, and above all to the senses. In a word, he brings learning and inspiration, never a facile improvisation, closer together and maintains a very special balance between passion and reason. In short, Paz questions reality, language, and life itself. This is, he often reminds us, the modern attitude. Above all, he intensifies our experience and makes us more aware of all that goes on around us. Despite his complexity of thought and language, his poetry appeals to our senses and in perfect equilibrium to our intellect as well. I am glad to have had this opportunity to say a few things about a man and a writer whom I so very much admire and to whom I owe a great deal. His human commitment is exemplary. His superb verse dazzles us by its brilliance, and his thought, always provoking opens doors and windows. Paz, the author of great books and great poems, is a universal writer of superlative quality, a leading world intellectual who believes, among other things, in dialogue. Tonight, as I understand the program, and also as Professor Williams has explained, there will be a dialogue in the best sense of the word, as Paz has graciously agreed to answer your questions when he has finished his exposition on poetry, prose, and history in Latin America. On closing, I want to leave you with a phrase taken from El Arco y la Lira, in which Octavio Paz asks the following: would it not be better to turn life into poetry rather than to make poetry from life? If I understand the sense of the question he poses, and I think I do, it seems to say it all. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Octavio Paz.
Well, I am very moved by the words of my old friend, Alan Phillips. We are really very old friends, and as Mexican writer and Mexican reader, I own many good moments because Alan Phillips has written some very important essays on Mexican and Spanish American literature, and especially perhaps the best book on Ramon López Velarde. Then when I hear him talking about me with such generosity, precision, and kindness, I am moved. Perhaps I understand that he exaggerates, but it's marvelous to hear this kind of exaggerations. Now, before I start, I would like to define, or rather to clarify, the limits of this conversation, because it's a conversation, not a lecture. I will speak about 15 or 20 minutes, and then I will hear your comments and will try to answer your questions and objections. I hope you will be patient with my English, because it is a language of my own invention and only remotely related with the English tongue. Finally, the subject of this dialogue. In the beginning was called Poetry, Prose in Latin America, and Morals and Political History in Latin America, but really it was too much, and I tried to limit to some specific questions. I will try first in my exposition to describe briefly some of the most salient characteristics of the Spanish-American intellectual tradition. But I will not speak about the great achievements of the Spanish-Americans and the Brazilians in the fields of poetry and fiction. I cannot, because it's too big, this subject. Nor I will touch upon the works of our thinkers, even though some of them are truly original thinkers, as the Argentinian Sarmiento, or the Peruvian Mariátegui, or the Mexican Vasconcelos. My subject will be more narrow and restricted, more not linked with literature, but with history, with the history of our societies, the moral temper and the attitudes of our intellectual class, again, with a great limitation, with respect to a single question, modernization. I will explain why modernization for me is is a central question. Since the end of the 18th century, our nations, I am talking about all the Spanish American nations, have faced a great historical challenge. How can we be modern? In this period, I mean in the 18th century, the Hispanic world, or rather the elites of the Spanish Empire under a great king, Charles III, realized that Spain and her dominions have been left behind by the great modern European nations, England, France, etc. In this moment, a great movement of reform starts in our culture. This movement not always was well inspired. Many times they made great mistakes. They ignore the authentic Spanish tradition. But the aim was important. It was a renovation of our civilization. This time was the time of the enlightened despotism in Europe. Frederick in Prussia, Catherine in Russia, etc. But I must add that the despotism of Charles III was rather benign. Even I wonder if we should call him a despot. He was a great king, but he wanted to reform Spain from the top. He never thought in a revolution from the bottom, but they were thinking it was a movement, a reform movement of an elite. It was to change Spain and the Spanish Empire from the top. The means to achieve this reform was to adapt some of the ideas of the European Enlightenment. It was to be a revolution, I should say, by decree, a pacific revolution by decree, a revolution without revolt, and also a revolution not by the invention or the creation of new ideas, but by the adaptation of the principles of the European Enlightenment. The reform misfired partially, but it started a movement that since this period has been the constant inspiration of our history. It has assumed many uncontradictory forms: popular revolt, paternalism, education, dictatorships, etc., and with different ideologies. Sometimes was Republican ideologies, radical ideologies, a great number of ideologies, but all of them with the same purpose: modernization. Our countries wanted to be modern, and that has been the meaning of the history of Latin America since the end of the 18th century. As in Europe and in the United States, the agent of the reform has been, in Latin America, the intellectual class. In general, when we speak about the difficulties to achieve modernization in our countries, we refer to historical, political, and economic conditions. But seldom we speak about the characteristics of the class that is supposed to be the incarnation of modernity, the intellectuals. Now, I think that without an analysis of its characteristics, we cannot understand the process of modernization in Latin America and its enormous setbacks. Now, I will speak mostly about Mexico, because it is the country I know better. But I believe that many of my observations can be applied to the other Latin American countries, with, of course, exceptions and reservations in many cases. I start with a rather obvious remark. In Mexico, during the 7th and 18th centuries, the great majority of the intellectuals belonged to the church. Lawyers, theologians, physicians, humanists, mathematicians, astronomers, also astrologists, because in this time astrology and astronomy were linked, professors, and naturally many poets. All of them, or almost all of them, were clerics. They belonged to the Catholic Church. Some, the majority, were very competent. Others were eminent. We had great historians, for instance, Clavijero, and many others. And even we had some genius, one woman, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Now, all of them were intellectuals inside of a closed system. They were inside of an orthodoxy, and they were the defenders of an orthodoxy. That we must remember the characteristics of the ideology of New Spain. It was a closed system, neo-scholasticism, defensive, very subtle, with a fighting spirit, and identified with the social order. I mean, with the monarchy, with the Spanish monarchy, and intolerant of criticism. There was only one true, and there was no discussion about the essential principles. That was then the real tradition of Mexico, and I suppose all Latin America until the 18th century. Now, if we think in the European example, we will find that, of course, in the 16th and 17th century, also the intellectual class in Europe was clerical. But already at the end of the 17th century and then more clearly in the 18th century, more and more the intellectual class was independent. And one of the great shifts in the sociology, I should say, of culture is the shift of the professions of the intellectuals in the 18th century. We have in France les philosophes, people who were not clerics, who were not militant Catholics, who were critics of the established principles, and who start to make a new philosophy. The same phenomenon in England. Then, in the 18th century, Europe experiments the great cultural revolution. It was much more a cultural revolution, this revolution, than the so-called Chinese cultural revolution, who was rather destructive. But in Europe, yes, it was a cultural revolution because it was a change, first, of the social structure of the intellectual class. Secondly, because it was a change of ideology, of philosophy. And finally, and the most important thing, because not only was a change of ideas, but a change of manners and a change of attitudes. It was an interiorization of the new ideas. It was a new men appear in Europe, modern men. And this same phenomenon was here in this country. In this country, you had the same enormous change. It was the beginning of the real modernity. Now, in Mexico, not in this time, little later, at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, linked many times with the movement of independence, the Mexican intellectual class, many of them members of the church, still assimilated the ideas of the Enlightenment, the modern ideas. In the name of modernity or progress, there was also a change of ideology. But here we must find some remarks rather important. We must make some remarks. The first one, it was an ideology who was adapted from Europe and afterwards from United States. I mean, it was not a creation of Latin America, Spain, or Mexico. Secondly, it did not correspond, at least in the case of Mexico, to the national situation or to the tradition of Mexico. It was a change, but it was a change who has not a clear connection with the real problems, and we could see it very clearly during the movement of independence. It was an imitation. Now, in history, there are many different kinds of imitations. There are fertile or productive imitations. For instance, when the Romans took some of the institutions or the philosophy or the art of the Greeks, it was a fertile imitation. When the Japanese took the Chinese civilization or then the Western civilization and adapted, it was a fertile imitation. In the case of Latin America, our imitation was not fortunate because we didn't adapt it, we didn't change it. We took the ideas, but we didn't change them. We never thought to make an adaptation to these ideas to the social realities of Latin America. And then the fourth remark, this is the most important. Intellectuals in Latin America, in Mexico especially, since I am talking about Mexico, change their ideas, change their philosophy, but not their moral attitudes, not their moral temper. They never abandon their love for global explanations. One of the most important things of the New Spirit was the refuse to accept global explanations. But in Latin America, intellectuals accept global explanations. And especially the crusade spirit. In the 16th and 17th century, the Hispanic world, the intellectuals of the Hispanic world were crusades of the Counter-Reformation. In the 19th century, the Mexican liberals, were against crusades with different ideas, but the same attitudes. They were as intolerant as their predecessors of the 16th and 17th century. Now, I ask, how can we be the agents? How can we be the agents of modernity if we are modern only in name? Because one thing is to have a modern ideology, that is very easy, it's a set of principles. Another thing is to change inside yourself. This is the important thing, to change your attitudes, first with yourself and then with your fellow countrymen. And that was the important thing. In the 19th century, we have a very tragic phenomenon, the fight between liberals and conservatives in Mexico. In many countries, we have had this ideological contest, even in this country, between liberals and conservatives. But in Mexico, because both parties were intolerant, because both parties were not real modern. They were fighting in the name of modernity, but they were not modern. We had civil wars. It was tragic. In the name of tolerance, modernity is tolerance, we were being intolerant. The victory of the liberals produced something very strange: the elimination at the end of the 19th century of the Conservative Party. Then we have, for 30 years, a dictatorship, the dictatorship of General Porfirio Díaz. He was a liberal. He was not a conservative. He was a liberal. And the people who were with him in power were liberals. But were liberals who didn't give the power. They were modern only because the ideas were modern and the dress was modern. But inside, they were not modern. In this time, there was also another intellectual change. Instead of the philosophy of 18th century, Enlightenment, liberalism, etc., the intellectual Mexican class, and it was the same in South America, in Brazil, for instance, they embraced, adopted positivism. Sometimes in the Saxon version, but especially in the French version, Auguste Comte. Well, then we changed from liberalism to positivism, from 18th century philosophy to 19th century scientism. We displaced Voltaire and we adore Auguste Comte. But the Mexican positivists were the high priest of science. But they were priests of science as the theologians, the neo-scholastic friars of the 16th and 17th century. And the dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz was not a conservative, as many historians have said. Dictatorship was a mestizo version, a modern version of 18th century enlightened despotism. They wanted again to change, as Charles III, from above, from the top. They achieved some material progress, but not moral and not political progress. The most terrible thing is that in the name of modernity, not only they were not really modern, but they were talking about, in the name of democracy, because Mexico was a democracy in the Constitution, in the name of the Republic, in the name of Republican institutions, they were not democratic. Then it was introduced the lie in the life of Mexico. This lie is also, you will find this lie in all Latin America. Then we had the last episode, the Mexican Revolution. Now, if we see the Mexican Revolution with eyes, without prejudice, we will find something very strange. The intellectuals were not so important in the Mexican Revolution. It was a real popular revolt. Of course, there were some intellectuals. For instance, Vasconcelos was a revolutionary, Martin Guzman, but not many. Orwell, second-rate intellectuals. The great intellectuals of the period were already partisan of the ancien regime of Porfirio Díaz. They didn't participate in the Mexican Revolution. But after, when the revolution won, they were called by the government, and they collaborated with the government, with the revolutionary government, and in some way that was positive, because the revolutionary government needed these intellectuals to start to create a new country. And then, during these 50 years of our history, this half a century after the revolution, we have had a new intellectual class. This new intellectual class was born, and it has been integrated with the government. It's again a class inside a closed system as in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. In my book, The Labyrinth of Solitude, I explained how the collaboration of the government in the two last chapters, the collaboration of the intellectuals with the government has had many positive sides and also very negative sides. I will not now repeat all this. No? But the important thing is that this new intellectual class has, of course, produced many of the important things that we have in Mexico are the work of this new intellectual class. That's why I said it's positive. But perhaps should be better to make a explanation. In this class, there is a group, very important, very powerful, the Marxist group. Some of them are Marxist-Leninists, some of them are only Marxist. Well, clearly, this group who has collaborated many times with the Mexican government, and sometimes has been an ally of the Mexican government, sometimes has been a critic of the Mexican government. This group is not really modern because they are still, as the neo-scholastics of the 17th century, crusades. Now, in the name of historical materialism, as the positivists of Porfirio Diaz were crusades in the name of science, or the Jacobins of the 19th century were crusades in the name of liberal ideas. But the majority are integrated, the majority of the intellectuals are integrated in the government, and many of them are interested in social reform. And they have, as interested in social reform, they have proposed many things. Now, for me, perhaps one of the great limitations of this new intellectual class is that they have not seen many times very clearly the connection between social reform and political reform. I think the political change is the first priority of a society. If we want that a society change in an economic and social sense, we must make first changes in the political setup. It means democracy. The other is enlightened despotism. Enlightened despotism under Porfirio Diaz, enlightened despotism under the Mexican Revolution. But always has been reform from the top, sometimes with the best intentions. That's why when I wrote a book called about the modern state called El Logro Filantropico, because this is the situation, enlightened despotism. Now, for me, the real change should be democracy, and democracy is political reform. Now, in Mexico, and I think this can be applied for all Latin America, we live in the end of a great period. In Mexico, we live at the end of a great period. This period will start 50 or 60 years ago with the Mexican Revolution. Everybody's talking about crisis. First, financial crisis. Well, it's very important, the debt, economic crisis. All this is very important, it's true, but the economic crisis in some way is a product of the political crisis and the moral crisis. The most important thing is the political and the moral crisis. And only political change can produce change in the economic and social fields. Now, to modernize, to modernize the others, to modernize the country, we must be modern ourselves. To learn to be modern is to learn to be tolerant, to be really democratic. And that, for this, the Latin American intellectuals, or the Mexican intellectuals, needs a examination of consciousness, a reflection of the past, and the ideas and attitudes of the past 50 years. In Mexico, we have a small group of writers. We had a small magazine called Vuelta. In this magazine, it's a literary magazine, it's a cultural magazine. We are much more interested, frankly, in poetry or in literature than in politics, but we cannot separate politics of the other things. And in this magazine, we are very much interested to talk about politics. And one of the aims of the magazine is the criticism of the intellectual class, in the sense that this class must be really modern, not in the sense of the ideas, but in the sense of the attitudes. I think we are not only at the end of a period in Mexican history, we are at the beginning of a new period. I am not pessimist as many people. I am pessimist or optimist are words that I don't have great confidence. They are empty words. I think something new is going to start in Mexico if the country is going to move. If this country, my country, is going to live, must be a great political change. I mean, we must have more democracy in Mexico. And that is my explanation. That's why it's very important that the intellectuals could be aware of this situation for me. Now I will be gladly to answer questions.
Could you please tell me how this transformation is going to take place to increase democratization in Mexico? How will this happen? And more importantly, from your perspective, how do you think it should happen?
Well, you know, I am not a prophet. I don't know how it's going to be this modernization or this democratization. But I see that, or well, there is democratization, or well, is stagnation. Now, stagnation means dangers in the future, violence in the future. I believe in a pacific and gradual evolution. And that's why I think it's very important the collaboration of the intellectual class. If the intellectual class can renounce to the simplistic violence of the 60s and the 70s, to the simplistic ideas of the last years and the slogans of global solutions, and is more realistic, more sober, in this moment, perhaps we have possibilities of change.
Do you foresee a change in the Partido Revolucionario Institucional in the coming years?
No, I would like to perceive a change in this party, because we owe to this party many good things, especially the peace and stability of the last 50 years. But I don't think, unfortunately, I don't see any change, and this is very unhappy. But I suppose realism will prevail.
You have spoken of modernization and the need for greater democracy. And in your analysis, you mostly have mentioned the history of European developments and their arrival to this continent.
Of what?
The development, tal vez debería hablar en español, hablo en español, but they won't understand.
No.
The European people, Spain, England, France, and all the other powers that invaded this continent and colonized, and your analysis then is an elaboration on these developments, a look at these developments. We come to a time when we speak of greater democracy and modernization. And throughout all this, we don't seem to pay much attention to the cultures of this continent and the peoples of this continent. I think that we must begin to look at not only the European intellectual activity and products, but also to the native peoples and the product of native civilizations. which are certainly at this time by intellectuals, I hope, cannot be considered neither pagan or ignorant or savage. Modernization presents a problem. The industrial, technological, economic structure, together with the military establishment and the desire to conquer nature and space, which are all European kind of mentality, is producing a great devastation of environments and cultures. The endangered species list is increasing. Native populations are being destroyed. Genocide continues. It continues today here in the United States. It continues throughout all Latin America. Whether it's the name of Marxism or Christianity or modernization, genocide continues. And the destruction of the thought and the civilization of native peoples. So what would you say about this subject?
Well, you know, it's too much. We must take one point behind the other. You have a good point saying that most attention must be paid to the ancient cultures. When we were talking about modernization, I was thinking not only in, I was thinking in the situation of the Hispanic countries and Hispanic culture. Of course, I believe, as you, that these old cultures, pre-Columbian cultures, are very important. They have been destroyed, but there are still fragments alive that we must not preserve, because I don't believe in preservation. But they must live if they can live. No, this is one question. Excuse me, you spoke too much.
I bring just one more point.
And you asked me many questions.
Allow me one more question. The question of democracy. I don't believe in democracy. According to our ancient traditions, democracy is based on the idea there is a majority and a minority. There always must be losers, and these losers will become sources of problems and trouble for the social order. If we want to truly evolve, and you have said an examination.
Excuse me, if you don't believe in democracy, do you believe in what? As political organization.
I believe in another way of thinking and in another way of arriving to decisions.
For instance?
For instance, among the Hopi people, the Hopi, Navajos and other tribes in this United States, and I assume perhaps similar traditions exist throughout Latin America, exists a method of arriving to decisions which is not based on voting and a majority against a minority. Is perhaps better described as some sort of consensus process where everybody agrees and everybody is considered and no losers are produced in the process. So again, democracy is an idea of the European civilization. Whether we take Marx or Christianity or democracy, we are elaborating on the invasion.
You know, the problem with the Hopis or the Navajos is that they are not the real estates. They are small groups. They are not nations, first. Secondly, it's true that democracy